given the toxicity of the atmosphere at the top of government, he's actually managed to attract some quite heavyweight figures into government. But even they, crazed by ambition that they may have been, in the end had enough. And I think the really important thing about Boris Johnson is he has almost no personal loyalties. Boris Johnson doesn't have that. He doesn't inspire loyalty. Anyone who trusts him ends up regretting it.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. A political earthquake in Britain. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson was forced to step down after revelations of lying over an MP, a member of Parliament, accused of sexual assault. And of course his drinking parties in number 10 Downing Street during the COVID lockdowns. Johnson's 2.5 years in office has been plagued by scandal and chaos. He has left Northern Ireland in turmoil over the Brexit deal with Europe. While his support of Ukraine has been positive, Britain's relationship with Europe is a mess. And on this podcast, Ukraine and the way forward, we talk to commentator and Kyiv resident Paul Niland. But first, let's hear from Liberal Democrat candidate Edward Lucas on the resignation of Boris Johnson. All right, Edward Lucas joins me from London. Edward is a candidate for the Liberal Democrats in Westminster, and he is also a well-known writer and security analyst. Hi, Edward.
Hello.
Incredible days as Prime Minister Boris Johnson came under all of this pressure to resign. And a lot of people said, like former President Trump, kind of refused to go initially.
Yes, incredible days, incredible hours, incredible minutes. We are glued to our phones and to our televisions and our radios. And we think at the moment, as I'm talking to you, Boris Johnson seems to be wanting to stay on as a caretaker prime minister in Downing Street while the Conservatives elect a new leader. But some of his MPs are saying, no, you've got to go right now.
Isn't that normal for a British Prime Minister to stay until the party has time, and sometimes that takes months, to select a replacement?
Yes, and Theresa May announced that she was she was resigning and there would be Conservative leadership, but she wasn't so controversial as Boris Johnson. Your viewers may remember that her premiership was shipwrecked on the inability to get the Brexit deal through. But it wasn't the same sort of moral crisis that's hanging over the Johnson administration. And I think that the Conservative MPs are both trying to weigh up who's going to be the next leader and where they should position themselves on that, but also trying to minimize the damage to the party caused by the eviction of Boris Johnson. And they are all plotting like mad at the moment, trying to work out what to do. And there's a distinct lack of clarity.
In the end, why did Boris Johnson have to go?
The old-fashioned phrase moral turpitude, I think, would fit it, that he had a systematic disregard for the truth, for the rules, for the conventions of human behavior. He was driven by an enormous ambition dating back to when he was a kid, and he said, I want to be world king, a streak perhaps of narcissism. And he just would never fit in with the written and unwritten conventions and rules of how this political system's meant to work. And in the end, it caught up with him. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time.
Straight out lied about parties in Downing Street, lied about an MP who sexually assaulted, is the allegation, not once, but when Boris Johnson was the foreign minister, it was brought to his attention that this man had another incident where he, with allegations of some kind of sexual assault. And despite that, Boris Johnson allowed him to be appointed the deputy party whip, correct?
That's correct. So the final scandal that came on so many others was to do with a man called Chris Pincher, who was the deputy whip, which is a sort of role in the British Parliament that combines enforcing party discipline, but also looking after the welfare of the members of Parliament. And it was claimed that the Prime Minister had no knowledge of some serious allegations that had been made about Mr. Pincher in the past. And what really led to his downfall was when the former head of the Foreign Office, the civil servant who'd been running the Foreign Office, issued a statement saying actually there'd been serious allegations about Mr. Pincher when Mr. Pincher was a junior Foreign Office minister, and that Mr. Johnson had been told about these allegations. They resulted in Pincher apologising, and he then stopped being a minister. But it was quite untrue for Boris Johnson to say he had no idea. And this just compounded a number of other things where he'd apparently joked that Pincher was a bit handsy, which is a sort of British euphemism for being a sort of mild sexual assault. And he'd also blamed the MPs, said if only the MPs had managed to get Mr. Pincher's drinking in check, we should say Mr. Pincher's apologised for getting.
I have to interrupt you here because it's really an important point, and I think somebody focused on it yesterday in a committee hearing where she said you're giving excuses to somebody who sexually assaulted people because you're saying that there are some drinking problems in your party. I mean, the idea that all of this is okay just because people had drinks says a lot about the character and moral judgment of Boris Johnson.
Well, it also says something about the character of life at Westminster and indeed in Downing Street, that there is there are many legislatures are either dry or places where drunkenness is unusual. The House of Commons and House of Lords is unusual in having restaurants and bars sort of built into the physical fabric and a culture of drinking built into the social fabric. So there are plenty of opportunities, things to go wrong. But you're absolutely right. This starts from 2017 when Chris Pincher was first a whip, and he was fired after allegations of unwanted hands-on massages. He was then brought back into government by Boris Johnson into the Foreign Office. He was then made housing minister, then a deputy chief whip. And the whip's office was informed at the time that Pincher had been made an unwanted pass at another man. Then he gets drunk in 2022 in June at an event in a private club in London, apologises and resigns. And then it turns out that Boris actually had known about this all along. And that's the just the latest in a whole series of evasions and dishonesties and brushes with propriety that have just characterised his career since his early days as a journalist.
I can't help but look at some of this a bit cynically, because we've been watching how some of the conservative cabinet members have resigned, but a lot of them even accepted, including the Chancellor, accepted a new post. And then kind of when they read the writing on the wall that Boris Johnson may not survive, they put out these letters and tweets saying, that it's time for him to go. But up until the last minute, for the sake of power, a lot of them were willing to accept anything that he did.
Yes, ambition is a very powerful drug, and not only for Boris Johnson, but for other people. And the thought of being a minister was very appealing. And the government payroll vote, if you include the members of the cabinet, the junior ministers, the so-called parliamentary private secretaries, who are the sort of lowest rung on the ladder, that's 100 plus jobs, and people go into politics so they want to make a difference and exercise power. And if you keep your nose clean and suck up to the leadership, then you may get one of those jobs, and if you don't, you won't. So I think he's given the toxicity of the atmosphere at the top of government, he's actually managed to attract some quite heavyweight figures into government, but even they, crazed by ambition that they may have been, in the end had enough. And I think the really important thing about Boris Johnson is he has almost no personal loyalties. Most politicians have a bunch of people who they look out for, those people look out for them, and that's the kind of the home team. And Boris Johnson doesn't have that. He doesn't inspire loyalty. Anyone who trusts him ends up regretting it. So it makes the situation, the position quite unstable. But once people start deserting him, nobody wants to be Boris's last friend. You don't want to stay on the sinking ship with the captain when everyone else has got in the lifeboat.
Or as the opposition leader put it yesterday, this is the first case where the sinking ships are deserting the rat.
Yes, one could also say that the lifeboats are very crowded. I'm surprised. He has apparently announced that there's going to be he's completed appointments to put a full cabinet in, and of course, for people who seem to be able to having it both ways, they're saying, I want Boris Johnson to resign. He's not fit to be prime minister, but I'm happy to serve in his government, at least for now. So this is pushing the conventions of British politics hard in a previously untried direction.
What is the danger of Boris Johnson staying on for months as a caretaker prime minister?
Well, I think he feels that so long as he's in Downing Street, he's got options, and once he's out, he doesn't. There's also the question of whether he might call a snap general election. He does have some powers to do this. He can go to the Queen and say, I want you to dissolve Parliament, and he could then go to the country on a back me or sack me platform. The question is, would the Queen allow this? And it would put her, as a supposedly non-political figure, in a difficult position, because she might say to him, no, I'm going to ask someone else to form a government who has a majority in the House of Commons. She might go back to Theresa May, the former prime minister, and ask her to do it on a caretaker basis. But we are in absolutely uncharted waters constitutionally on this. There's also a suggestion the Queen might just refuse to see Mr. Johnson, and therefore get away, dodge the decision that way. But there's no doubt he has one card left to play, which is to try and call a general election, disastrous though that might be for the Conservative Party. And it may be he's going to threaten them with that for a bit.
Do you think he would break his word? He would be able to do that he would say, I'm going to be a caretaker prime minister until the Conservative Party, my party, it's his party, elects a new leader, and then he could suddenly do a 180-degree turn and do that?
I don't think you do that. No, I think what he might do is say say that we're in a situation of national crisis, and we haven't got time for a leadership election right now. We need a general election, and it would be just devastating for the Conservative Party, and they're saying no, don't do it. But that's the one card he's got left to play. I don't quite see how it ends well for him, but it would end very badly for the Conservative Party. So it's a bit like he's got a hand grenade there, and he's saying, "Come any closer, and I'll pull the pin."
Last question to you on international affairs. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, if he writes his own political epitaph today, will be saying that he was a great addition and that he did wonderful things on the international stage. Do you think, when you look at Northern Ireland, when you look at Britain's relationship with the rest of Europe, there's only pluses in seeing Boris Johnson leave the political stage?
I think that the overwhelming verdict on his premiership will be missed opportunities. He has got a few things right. He was keen on supporting Ukraine from the beginning, although I believe he did that only to distract attention from his troubles at home. I think that the damage he's done to Britain's international reputation by trashing our adherence to international agreements, particularly the Northern Ireland Protocol, and picking pointless fights with the EU on that and other issues looks very bad in retrospect. And Britain is a very serious partner in Europe when it comes to military security, intelligence, defence, as well as economy. And under Boris Johnson, we're punching below our weight rather than above our weight, because there's a kind of Johnson discount, which means that other politicians, other European leaders don't really want to hang out with him very much. And we have a small number of countries. Ukraine is one, Estonia is another, who would be very close to Britain in defence terms. So they're willing to make time for him. But I think there will be an enormous sigh of relief in capitals all across the world if they thought that Boris isn't coming anymore.
Edward Lucas, great to talk to you. Thank you, Edward.
My pleasure.
All right, joining me now from Kyiv is Paul Niland, who's been a regular on this podcast. He's a journalist, and he is the founder of Lifeline Ukraine. And Paul, I always ask you to say what is Lifeline Ukraine, because you're the one best able to define it.
I'm always happy to talk about Lifeline Ukraine. We are the national suicide prevention hotline here in Ukraine.
Mainly dealing with military and people, combat vets who have been serving in lines of conflict since 2014.
Primarily, that's exactly why we were established. But we transitioned some time ago, and we are simply the suicide prevention hotline for all Ukrainians. And while the needs, obviously, of the psychological needs of our military veterans are really, exponentially growing since 24th of February, there are many elements of society here that have suffered as a result of this all-out war. There are so many people who are displaced, for example. We're providing support for them. There are sadly so many victims of sexual violence.
An entire traumatized country and a lot of shell-shocked people, and that's you. You're going to have a lot of work ahead of you, and I'm sorry to say. But Paul, let's get to it. I mean, as we're talking, Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the UK is about to resign, forced out of office. And he has, when it comes to Ukraine, always been one of the UK has been one of the biggest defenders of Ukraine and supporters of Ukraine in this war against Russia. Do you think anything changes? Does it turn on Boris Johnson's personality in any way?
I don't think it does. The other prominent British political figure has been the Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace. He's visited Kiev several times. He's very, very outspoken. I don't think that the UK's support for Ukraine militarily, politically, financially, I don't think that depends on one person. In fact, I was watching the Prime Minister's question time yesterday in the House of Commons, and I noticed so many members of Parliament were wearing lapel pins that were a joint British and Ukrainian flag, and several other people were wearing ties in the blue and yellow of Ukraine's national flag. And there's cross-party support for Ukraine, both in the UK and in the United States as well, I have to say. So I'm not worried about Boris Johnson being moved aside. Personally, I think it's about time that happened for many reasons.
And by the way, Ben Wallace may indeed find himself as one of the potential replacements for Boris Johnson, and his name is already being put out there. Do you, listening to the head of the British Army, say that this is Europe's 1937 moment, looking at the war with Russia? Do you think that's an overstatement? Is that over dramatized?
It's not an overstatement. I think the 1937 moment or the 1938 moment was actually 2014. It was when Russia began occupying Ukrainian territory in Crimea and in the Donbass as well. Where we are now, sadly, we're 1939. There is an all-out war. It is the most brutal war that is being fought on, and that includes, what happened in the Balkan countries as well. It's the most brutal and bloody war that is being fought on European soil since the Second World War for 7 decades now.
What are the stories that stick in your mind? Because I know you talk to a lot of, and I follow you on social media. Sadly, first of all, you hear about friends or people that that have been killed in action. But what are some of the stories that really strike you from that war that, we get snippets of, but daily it is raging, and it is apparently very brutal in the East?
It's very, very brutal in the East. There's a lot of brutality as well towards the residents of the occupied cities in the south of Ukraine as well, from the Russian forces that are holding on to those places temporarily. As we talked about Lifeline Ukraine earlier, and it being established first and foremost to support the military, many of my colleagues are themselves veterans, and therefore they were part of the military reserve, and they were all called up on the 23rd of February. And in addition to my colleagues having gone back to war, I know dozens of people who are fighting. And every day I dread seeing the news that I've lost someone who's close to me. That's the reality of this war, though, that is going to happen. And I think I've forgotten the rest of your question.
That's all right. I think we're 4 months into this, right? We're over 4 months into this, and it has to be grinding, not only on you, but imagine those people that, are at the front fighting. And I don't know how those soldiers are carrying on when they are so outgunned and so outnumbered right now. And how much longer can they hold out and hold on there?
I know how they're carrying on. I know their mindset. I saw actually one of my friends who was back in Kyiv for a week of R&R first of all, and then a week of training before he redeployed. And the spirit amongst the Ukrainian defenders is that they will fight to the very end. They will fight until every square inch of Ukrainian soil is liberated, and there are no compromises on this. No compromises. And the reason why,
that's all very grand and gallant and sincere. And I know the Ukrainian army has already shown. That they will hold ground and retake ground in some of the worst circumstances. But this can go on for a year or three. And President Putin doesn't care about his own people, how many he feeds into that machine where he's losing thousands and thousands of his own soldiers without admitting it publicly. But can the Ukrainian army carry on though without breaking?
It's not a question of can they. They will. They absolutely will. And you're right in what you say as well. Your observation about Putin not caring about his own losses. The Russian military deaths, and that's just deaths. That's not casualties or wounded in action. It is about to cross the threshold of 37,000. It's interesting to point out as well that there have been very few Russian military deaths from the major population centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg, because they're really not drafting and recruiting people from there. It's the poorer regions of Siberia from which the Russian army is being constituted. But if the initial invasion force that was on the borders prior to the 24th of February was 190,000 troops, with 37,000 killed in action and something like, double that number who are wounded in action as well.
I think it's even more than that. People say that you can take the math and multiply it by 4 times. So then you're talking about, over 100,000 that are wounded in action, 120,000. Nobody will ever know that number, or not for a long time.
Well, conventionally, yeah, that's the ratio. It's 1 to 4. But another thing about the way that the Russian military operates is they're leaving their injured on the battlefield. So somebody who has taken a bullet wound that could have been medevaced, that could have been saved, or even with a simple tourniquet, they're just leaving them behind. And this friend of mine who I mentioned, who I saw last week, he was telling me that they came into contact with an advancing Russian group. As soon as the Russians saw the Ukrainians up ahead of them, several put their hands in the air and thought, this is an opportunity to surrender. And they were fired on from behind by their own people, by their own forces. Because
it really sounds like Stalingrad. It sounds like World War II stuff where I'll never forget the chapter in the book or the scene in the movie on Stalingrad. You follow him, and when he gets killed and drops his weapon, you're there to pick it up, and you better keep going because you'll be fired on if you try and turn around.
See, it's exactly what they're doing. Exactly what they're doing. Their tactics have not changed, and it's just as you say. Putin does not care about his losses. He's managing to hide them from the Russian population. But back in the very early days of the war, actually, I wrote an article then where I said that Russia's losses were actually going to be Putin's Achilles heel. Once the Russian population really finds out how many Russians have been killed here, that is going to be a catalyst for I believe, massive protests in Russia. But your question was about...
We differ on that. we differ on that, because I tend to think that Putin seems to have gotten stronger in some ways with his propaganda machine, feeding never-ending denazification, and other crap into the network news at night. So it's hard to say if he will reap that harvest where people suddenly turn on him and say, you've put us in where his inner circle says, you've put us in an impossible war that we're going to lose. Mm-hmm. We're losing billions because more than anything, I think that they're a greedy bunch of kleptocrats, and then will the public turn? And right now he's kind of got him with an iron fist. I mean, you take to the street even with a poster and you wind up in prison in there. But
it's up to 15 years for protesting against the war, for even using the word war. But I monitor propaganda and the kind of terminology that's being used in Russia quite closely. And actually, that term of denazification, it has almost dropped off the radar. It was something that didn't make sense. It didn't stick. But it made sense in the early days of the war for the justification of the special military operation. It's a war, is what it is. It made sense then because it relied on the years and years and years of propaganda that had been feeding exactly that narrative for quite a long time. But I don't think that Putin's strong at all. If you look, for example, at the NATO decision to grant Sweden and Finland membership, go back 6 weeks, and it was Peskov or it was Lavrov who was saying there will be consequences to this, and then a few days ago Putin said, so they've joined NATO, it doesn't really matter. He's not strong. He's not strong, and he is weak precisely because of what you've just pointed out there, that his rule is kleptocratic. There is nothing holding it together. There is no ideology that promotes the Putin system and makes it attractive to anywhere else in the world.
So here's the trouble I have, and you can help me through this. And that is that when I look at all the grand assessments from U.S. intelligence, from the British MOD, Ministry of Defense, some very good independent firms that daily put out assessments on the battlefield. They keep talking about the Ukrainians are getting stronger. There's more and more heavy weaponry arriving. The Ukrainians are fighting strong. The Russians are collapsing. The army is on the verge of collapse, or it can no longer project power beyond where it is because but they keep taking cities, and they have now just claimed, all of Lugansk. So where's the disconnect there? What am I missing? Because they keep advancing.
They do keep advancing, but if you look at the distance that they've actually covered, specifically in the east, we are 4 months into this war, and they're basically 40 kilometers further forward than they were at the beginning, right? That's not the hallmark of a great army managing to advance 10 kilometers on average per month. And what they're doing in the east is they're not so much seizing cities that will then be incorporated into some kind of, whether it's the DNR proxy puppet
or a full annexation,
or a full annexation. What they're doing is it's a scorched earth tactic. They are simply destroying these places. So they can talk about having taken Severodonetsk or Lysychansk to say that they've captured the entirety of the Lugansk Oblast, but there's nothing left there. These places are an uninhabitable pile of ruins.
Doesn't that play into Putin's plan, though, to, if you want to eliminate Ukraine, mm-hmm. if you're able to move all of the Ukrainian population out of those areas, you can then say they're pro-Russian areas, because there'll be nobody there to hold an argument with you.
Yes. Again, there's a disconnect between those things. But if you look at the destruction of those places and the destruction of the lives of the people who called those cities home as well, they are exactly the victims of this war, are exactly the people who Putin pretended that he was coming to liberate and protect. That's where the disconnect is. That's where this doesn't make sense.
And they will be the ones to carry on the resistance against any kind of annexation of their homes, I assume.
It's difficult to put up resistance when your city is being bombarded by artillery, but the resistance that is noticeable and noble is in the south of the country. It's in the occupied cities of Kherson and Melitopol. And if we
so what's happened there? Because they're the ones that we're not focused on right now, but they are key to it's a key economic area for Ukraine and grain exports and industry. And what's happened as the Federal Security Service, the FSB of Russia, and others have come in there to kind of, put in their local mayors and put in the local council and make it Russian. Mm-hmm. What's happening there?
So I, with regard to the FSB, there was a report yesterday that they are very active in Kherson, and Estonia's former president, Ilves, tweeted yesterday, you only send in the Gestapo for the real worst of the tasks, right? So that's really the right way of framing it. But Kherson itself, there was a lovely video 2 days ago of an older gentleman. It was his 93rd birthday, in fact, and he rode his electric scooter, his mobility aid, through the marketplace, playing the Ukrainian national anthem, and then a very well-known Ukrainian war cry that has become famous here in the last few months. He rode through the central market, playing these things, wearing a vyshyvanka, the traditional Ukrainian stitched shirts. And the resistance in Kherson, there's a lot of graffiti that's going up. There's a lot of posters that are going up. The same is true in Melitopol as well. And if we go back to the long-range heavy weaponry that we've been talking about, that's now being used to great effect in areas around Kherson and in areas around Melitopol as well. So the Russian ammunition and fuel supply logistics are what's being targeted right now. And it's a very, very deliberate tactic.
There's been a lot of ammunition depots and fuel depots that have been hit.
Yeah, in the south as well as in the east. But in general, the local resistance that we're seeing in the south, and again, they're not under artillery bombardment, so it's a bit of a different situation from the east. But the local resistance is truly heroic, and it has been since the very beginning as well. Like, those people were immediately, when their towns and cities were occupied, they were immediately out on the streets. And that's the mass demonstrations have been quelled for now, but what's going on under the radar, under the cover of night, and the local partisans, as well as certain special operations that are taking place in those cities as well. That's really changing the calculation in the south, and we know from reports, from intercepts, that the Russians are extremely worried about their hold on the south, and rightly so, because they've put up no fortifications. When the Ukrainian army comes, they're going to be faced with a military resistance, but they're not faced with like any physical barriers that they're going to have to overcome or anything like that. And the sooner it comes, the liberation, the sooner that comes, the less opportunities that Russia will have to attempt to build any fortifications down there.
If you were laying out a scenario where the Ukrainian army is going to come back and take those areas, what would be the timing of all of that, given the fact that they're still on a defensive footing from Lugansk, and then now the rest of the Donbass now is the Russian army's next target? I assume we're months and months away from that.
So when I was looking at what I expected to happen in the south, after Kherson, then the next city is Melitopol, then the next city is Berdyansk, and then you're on the door of Mariupol. But to put that into context, that's about 500 kilometers. And the rest of it is open steppe, it's farmland, it's, there are villages and there are towns there, but really those are the only big major population centers along the Azov coast. When I was talking with my friend, he was saying to me that traveling across open lands leaves you very exposed. And so it's going to be a slower process of liberating the Azov coast than I was envisaging. I'm not a military expert. I've just, through necessity, had to learn of this stuff over the last 8 years, really. But I won't put a time frame on it. But I'm absolutely certain that that is the end state of this. The end state of this is not only liberating what's been occupied since February 24th, but it's liberating what was occupied in 2014 as well, all of it, and then rebuilding it.
That's pretty heady stuff, because you're talking about the Crimea as well.
Yes, and I when I wrote an article about how the war ends. What I was saying there about Crimea is that I think it's going to require some kind of international independent administration for a period of time. The local population, they're apolitical. They'd be quite indifferent at the end of the day to whoever has control over that peninsula. By and large, certainly the minority.
I've been there.
Yeah,
I've been there pre-2014 when I have to go back a few presidents now, but when they were talking about ending the Russian lease on the port early, so I think there's certainly a population seems pretty pro-Russian when I was there.
So it was probably President Yushchenko that was talking about potentially not extending the lease. But it was interesting that the very first thing that Yanukovych did when he became president was he flew to Kharkiv and he signed an accord then with then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev to extend. I mean, I believe there was already like 8 years left on the lease, but they went and signed it for an additional 30 years or 35 years on top of that.
Well, we know he wasn't independent, and Putin actively campaigned for him at one point, right? Until they started to think that having Putin there wouldn't help him.
Prior to the Orange Revolution, there was a military parade in the center of Kyiv, and Putin was standing right next to Yanukovych, and Yanukovych took out a bag of sweets and offered one to Putin, and there was this kind of look from him of like, what are you doing? We're in public, you idiots, sharing sweets while they're watching a military parade on Kreshchatyk. But no, I like I was saying, I think in general the population of Crimea would be relatively indifferent. But I think the militarization that they've seen of their homes over the last 8 years, I think that must be turning a lot of them off. And there's certainly nothing positive that's come from Russian occupation for the local residents of Crimea. There's certainly no tourism boom. It's simply a massive military base, right?
Do you think that the Russians will get Odessa? Do you think that the Russians will come back for Kyiv? And if they can't take Kyiv, that they will at a minimum show the same respect for the civilian infrastructure there that they've done in recent months, which is zero, and that they may shell and bomb and missile attack the capital. So on Odessa and then Kyiv.
So on Odessa, there's one other important city as well. Well, I mean, all of these places are important. People live there. These are people's lives on the line. But the other very important place there is Mykolaiv as well. Mykolaiv is a shipbuilding port, and it's home to many people. But the idea of taking Mykolaiv and Odessa completes then the land corridor, not just from the occupied Donbass to Crimea, but then from Crimea through to Transnistria, which is the Russian-created enclave in Moldova. So that, I think, has been a part of Putin's planning. That is what he wants. But Odessa will never. There's 1 million people in Odessa, and they may be Russian speakers, but they are Ukrainians. They will never be occupied. Like we talk about the partisan resistance on the ground in places like Melitopol, it would be nothing compared to Odessa. The people
and the same applies to Kyiv. Obviously, nobody is going to let the Russians in, but they can attack it from the outside and do a lot of damage. Their
ability to attack Odessa from the sea is being pushed back by the weaponry, the anti-ship weaponry that is located down there now. The other question was about Kyiv. I said at the very beginning that there was no way that Russia would ever be able to encircle this city, much less capture it, and then much less hold it as well. And I remain convinced. I mean, we've seen.
But they can do a hell of a lot of damage, Paul.
They can, but
and they even attacked it when the NATO ministers were meeting, right?
They have attacked Kyiv from the air with cruise missiles on several occasions. They do it periodically so we had the UN, I think it was the UN Secretary General who was here, and at that same time, there was a missile that hit Kyiv. After the American defense and foreign secretaries were here, the train tracks that they'd left Ukraine on were also attacked, several hours later. The fact is that Russia can strike anywhere in Ukraine at any moment. We know that those of us who remain in this country, we know that we face that potential risk. But at the same time, there is no strategy, there is no logic behind it other than terror, the terrorization of the population. Because again, as I say, the Russian troops, even if they were backed up by the entirety of the Belarusian army as well, if Lukashenko is fully dragged into this war, they could still never encircle this city. Kyiv, you've been to Kyiv, it's an enormous place, right? And then there's 3 million of us here in this city. And I mean, I won't talk about what was going on locally in residential districts during the Battle of Kyiv, but not only would there be a very, very fierce military resistance, there'd be a very, very fierce local resistance as well. And it would take many forms, many, many aspects.
Paul Niland, it's always good to talk to you. And I know, I know it touches you personally, and you have your emotional moments, but I know you have a good sense of humor and you keep that with you as well. So don't lose that, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you, Dana. Always good to chat to you. Take care.
And that's our backstory this week, thanks to Paul Niland and Edward Lucas. I'm going away this summer. I will, however, put up some podcasts when I think the news demands it. And right now, the news cycle seems ferocious. And of course, I'll keep writing my regular newsletter on danalewis.substack.com. Thanks for listening to Backstory, and I'll talk to you again soon.